Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum here in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you all for joining us for this Readings from the Archives virtually over Zoom today. We've been doing this for the past few weeks, and we have one more coming up in this series during the coronavirus pandemic. I'm happy to announce the Gunn Museum is going to be reopening to the public by appointment starting Saturday, June 20th. So we're thrilled to be able to see you again in person here at the museum. I'd like to remind you that this program is being recorded so that people could access it after the live presentation today for those folks who weren't able to join us. And these papers that we're fortunate to have here at the Gunn Library and Museum were written in the early 1900s by residents who were members of the Washington Women's Club, and they're a really interesting look back at the history of Washington, Connecticut. So with that, I'd like to get started today. This program should last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we could open it up for some discussion afterwards if you recognize any place names in the reading. Or you might have some questions that you'd like to ask me about the paper. Feel free to do so. All you have to do is raise your hand at the end, and I'll unmute you, and we could have a brief discussion about the paper. So for today, I'll be reading a sketch of the Judea Female Seminary, written by Amy Kenyon, and it was read before a meeting of the Washington Women's Club on October 16th, 1911. It starts off by saying, whoops, let's make sure that this is working here. There we go. Mary Brimsmaid, a daughter of General Daniel B. Brimsmaid, graduated from the Mount Holyoke Seminary in 1846 and returned to her home on Washington Green. The influence of Mary Lyon had deepened and strengthened in her desire for unselfish service and a purpose to give herself to a vocation that would be helpful to others. She was born to be a teacher, and it was inevitable that she could gather a school about her as that the sparks fly upward. In the autumn, she began one with 16 girls in her father's house, whose site was in front of that of Brownlee. The front of the attractive old house is marked on the Brownlee lawn by a lilac bush at the north and a syringa at the south. Their number rapidly increased, and within 2 years, she removed her pupils from her home to find better accommodation in the ballroom of Uncle Andrew Heinz's house. The house since enlarged and altered into the White Inn. The growing school was soon in need of more space, and Mr. Frank Brimsmaid, a brother of Mary, came to the rescue. The membership of the Methodist Church had become very small, and its services few and far between. Mr. Frank arranged with its trustees that he should have a floor laid nearly level with that of the galleries, and that the second story should be made soon occupied by the Judea Female Seminary, as the school had begun to be called, while the occasional church services should continue on the lower floor. The gallery across the west end of the church and opposite the pulpit was much wider than the side galleries, and there was a breastwork along its front, with doors above that swung up to the ceiling and could be fastened there. This had been used for the Methodist class meetings, but was divided into 2 resuscitation rooms. The base of the large triple window with its arched middle member in the east wall of the church and over the pulpit came to the floor of the new schoolhouse. Outside blinds were placed on the windows of the second story. Thus, in a small way, Mr. Frank Brimsmaid provided a home for the Judea Female Seminary, as Mr. Richard S. Barnes has, in a large and stately way, for Wickham Rise. It was in September 1848 that the school moved into its new home. It was partly composed of boarding scholars who were distributed among the families about the green. The assistant teachers were boarded in these families and had charge of the girls, but there were never as many teachers as there were families. There were always a half dozen or more pupils in the house of General and Mrs. Brimsmaid. One of them tells us what a happy home it was, and how after evening study hour, they would gather around the open fire in the keeping room with their sewing to listen while General Brimsmaid read to them from a novel of the great Sir Walter. She recalls their Puritan Sabbath, which began at sundown on Saturday and was strictly kept until sundown on Sunday, when the social evening of the week began, the evening when friends gathered at each other's houses, and when the young men of their acquaintance were allowed to call upon the seminary girls, their elders being near at hand in a spirit of sympathy and not of espionage. One member of the school was from Alabama. Others came from Ohio and nearer states. No advertising was done, yet the pupils, counting both boarders and day scholars, numbered in the 70s or 80s. The familiar, perhaps too familiar sound of the gunnery bell is an echo from the Judea Female Seminary. Harriet Hickox, one of its pupils, wrote on December 11th, 1849, to her brother Orestes, quote, "I'm not going to school at present, as school has been interrupted by the placing on the roof there of a bell weighing 56 pounds, and by the putting in of new desks to accommodate 100 scholars," end quote. The bell rope came down into the schoolroom, and the bell was rung by the girls at the proper times. It was bought by Mr. Gunn and removed to the gunnery in 1869, when the seminary building was moved back from the road about 40 feet and made over under the direction of its new owner, Henry W. Woodruff. As the routine of the schoolroom, Miss Brimsmaid opened the school every day with a brief prayer and leading the scholars in the singing of Father, Water, Earthly Blisses, or How Gentle God's Commands, or some other familiar hymn. In this morning exercise in loving and intimate conversations with 2 or 3 girls at a time, in earnest talks to the school, her deep religious feeling wielded its influence. The course of study was modeled upon that of Mount Holyoke. Virgil, Cicero, Sallust were read, geometry, trigonometry, and chemistry were studied. Watts' On the Mind, Upham's Mental Philosophy, Paley's Natural Theology, and Butler's Analogy were carefully discussed. French was studied by many of the pupils. For a while, it was taught by a German professor, who sometimes expressed in English his desire to return to the land where his cradle was. The girls were interested in botany and eagerly gathered wildflowers and pressed them into herbariums. Mrs. Eleanor Boudinot Church, a fine musician, gave lessons on the piano and the guitar. Rhetoric was taught with many written exercises. Paradise Lost was used as a textbook. Shakespeare's plays were read, a certain character being given to a certain girl, the girls standing in a group to read the scenes and observing their exits and their entrances. Wednesday was a day by itself. The girls brought their fancy work and plied their fingers over it a part of the morning, while Miss Brimsmaid read to them from some delightful book. The forenoon usually ended with an exciting spelling match. The afternoon was given to poetical recitations, to the reading of compositions or of the school paper, and the performance of the calisthenic figures by the highest class in calisthenics. Visitors sometimes came to look and listen during these exercises. The pupils learned to reverence the genius of the poets and to love their poetry. They studied in a mood of admiration and delight. They were not placed in the chair of criticism to dwell upon deficiencies and to classify great authors in a condescending way. They carried on a school paper entitled The Bobolink and furnished it with stories and legends. The Bobolink of July 4th, 1849 contains a long and romantic account of the warfare and peacemaking of the old chiefs, Warramog and Shipwag. During the winter of 1849 and 1850, the village lyceum met weekly in the seminary schoolroom, and on alternate evenings were read before it the Judea Whippoorwill, the paper edited and published by the young gentlemen of the Judea Academy, Mr. Gunn being their school teacher. And the Chickadee, the paper of the young ladies of the Judea Female Seminary. It may be noticed that the seminary bobolink of the previous July was transformed into a chickadee for the winter. Miss Brimsmaid inspired nearly all her pupils with a love of study, and they worked hard. They felt none of the pressure of college exams, though. They strove to live up to her standards in every way. In her absence from the schoolroom, they were as quiet and studious as in her presence, though she set no monitor over them. The calisthenic exercises were one of the great pleasures of their schedule. They were made up of marching, of various graceful steps and poses, and of exercises with wands, all kept in time to the singing of the 16 girls required for a class. Every figure had its own stanza of song. One of them was, quote, "Come forth in the morning hours, we'll hasten to Flora's bowers, and a garland of sweetest flowers, so fresh and fair, we'll weave, end quote. And another began, quote, "I see them on their winding way, about their ranks the moonbeams play," end quote. The Brimsmaid pasture across the road with its Samson's Rock and its many trees gave the girls a fine playground. The stately black oak near the roadside with its neighbors often shaded them and their books in the summer school hours and gave them a pleasant place for study. The pasture is now transformed into the artistic garden and grounds of Mr. Eric K. Rossiter's residence. The culmination of the school year was examination day. The seminary windows were garlanded with ground pine, and a massive rope of it was hung across the room to mark the space for the visitors. Letters of moss spelled Excelsior above the big triple window which faced them and the scholars, and upon it, at either side of it, among festoons of ground pine and long gray moss, were hung the sketches of the drawing class and the Wednesday forenoon embroideries and fancy work. Parents and friends filled the seminary rooms to overflowing. The morning and afternoon were mostly given to recitations, in which the studies of the year were reviewed and problems in mathematics were worked out on the blackboard. These were varied by the entering procession of a calisthenic class led by Miss Brimsmaid. The girls in white dresses, their heads adorned with slender wreaths of red partridge berry, and its tiny leaves, and their wands lightly strung with ground pine. The graceful calisthenic exercises were always admired by the visitors. In the evening, compositions were read, poems and dialogues were recited, and the pupils of Mrs. Church played the piano or the guitar. Under her supervision, she herself was a beautiful singer. There were duets and quartets and songs in chorus by the school. So ended the great day, to be followed by a tomorrow of farewells. In the outside, in the time outside of school hours, walking parties were a favorite recreation. To the delight of the girls, Miss Brimsmaid usually joined them. She went with them so often into the little glen of hemlocks on the west side of the old North Road, and more than halfway from the green to Mallory Brook, that they named it Glen Mary. Prospect Hill, then rather a remote pasture, was one of their beloved places. They picnicked at the hemlocks in Nettleton Hollow. The early supper of those days, over by 5:30, allowed them many a walk to Steep Rock and back after tea. How they delighted in the woods, in the sunset time on the rock, and the going home by moonlight. It was an idyllic life they led. They were happy in Miss Brimsmaid's love for them, and in their worshipful devotion to her, in the kindly parental interest of General Brimsmaid and his wife, and in their intercourse with Mr. and Mrs. Gunn and other friends about the green. In the 5th year of Miss Brimsmaid's teachings, an outbreak of criticism and condemnation fell upon her for having calisthenics in her school and having had in her home some infrequent dancing and one evening of tableau. It was led by the minister of the Congregational Church, pictured here, Reverend Gordon Hayes. Probably it was this painful experience which induced her to accept an invitation to teach at the Archers School, a boarding school in Baltimore, and to put the seminary for the year 1851 and 1852 in charge of Miss Helen Mitchell of Washington and Miss Elizabeth Bissell of Litchfield. During her stay in Baltimore, the minister left Washington and the hostile criticism subsided. She returned to her own school the autumn of 1852 and was at the head of it for 2 more years, but in the autumn of 1854, she consented to teach one of the higher classes in the Packer Institute of Brooklyn, and the Judea Female Seminary lost her altogether. The school did not survive the loss, but a few years, Harriet Landon took charge of it the first year. Helen S. Goodwin of Morris, who had been a pupil and later Miss Landon's assistant, took charge the second year. It is difficult to learn who presided over the school the third year. If there was a third year, it must have been the last. Julia Leavitt, our Mrs. Richards, taught drawing in the seminary in one or more of these later years. Perhaps she was the assistant teacher and taught several subjects. In the Historical Museum in our library building are 2 circulars of the old school and a daguerreotype of a group of its scholars. It is a temptation to refer further to some of the teachers and pupils. Emmeline Steele of Washington and Harriet Landon of Salisbury, classmates of Mary Brimsmaid at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary and members of its Litchfield County Circle, succeeded each other as her chief assistants and were her close and lifelong friends. They and their teaching were greatly enjoyed by the girls. Jenny P. Smith, Mrs. Orville H. Platt, was one of her first pupils and her most devoted friend. The old school is still represented on Washington Green, with Mrs. Platt living at Kirby Corner and Mrs. Martha Gold in the mansion on Prospect Hill. with Emmeline Steele Vale and Mary M. Smith here every summer, and with Miss Silence Brimsmaid Baker, Keziah Farrand Mitchell, and Anna Cogswell Woodruff in their homes. To give the names of the old pupils who still live in the township might be too much like a catalog. But Mrs. Earl Buckingham, Helen Mitchell, who was a pupil and later a teacher, should be gratefully mentioned, and Candace Ford Seeley. Mrs. Seeley, in connection with Mary Brimsmaid Brown's memorial in our library building. She sent out numberless inquiries after the scholars of the old seminary, succeeded in communicating with quite a list of them, and carried on a correspondence that would have taxed many a woman in vigorous health. Caro and Sarah Sanford of New Milford were among the later pupils and were in the Brimsmaid home. Sarah became Mrs. William D. Black and the founder and patroness of the Ingleside School. She said again and again that Ingleside was a result of the inspiration she had received from Miss Brimsmaid, and that her highest hope for it all was to give it an atmosphere and an influence like that of the old school in Washington. Another of the seminary girls was Mary L. Atwater, now Mrs. William G. Choate of Wallingford, Connecticut, and New York City, the founder of the New York Diet Kitchen, the founder of the New York Exchange for Women's Work, and its president for 33 years, and the moving spirit in the establishment of the Rosemary Hall School for Girls and the Choate School for Boys. There are many others of the seminary pupils whose good deeds might be recited, for they all felt the personal and lasting force which urged them to noble living. The time of the Judea Female Seminary was in our little village a time surely of plain living, and perhaps of high thinking, of quiet, simple ways, and an absence of amusements. For the pupils of Miss Brimsmaid, the interest and the excitement of their lives lay in the enthusiasm she kindled in them and in her influence upon them. Her rich nature was the sun around which they revolved, reverencing her spirituality, rejoicing in her humor, and in her imagination, won by her lovely face and presence, and warmed by the love she gave them, each and all. And that concludes the reading of our paper today about the Judea Female Seminary. And this was written by Amy C. Kenyon and presented before the Washington Women's Club on October 16th in 1911. And with that, we can open up the program to our discussion period. If anyone out there has any comments or questions about what they may have heard in the presentation today, feel free to raise your hand and I'll be able to see you, and I can unmute you if you have any questions or comments. Anyone out there, any questions or comments? Okay, I see David's hand is up. Let me try to unmute you. Hold on one second here. Actually, I think I'm gonna hit that. Okay, are you unmuted, David? Hello, David.
Yeah. That photograph of Mary Mitchell Buckingham, where did that come from? That's interesting.
Yeah, right. Mary Mitchell, it's a daguerreotype here in the collection, so it wasn't fully cataloged, so we didn't know that we had it, but I found it in our collection of daguerreotypes. And do you want to tell the folks a little bit about her? I think you did some research into her in the past.
Well, it's very interesting because there's a whole story about her son Abner Buckingham. Um, she had a brother who was killed in the Civil War. Not sure if it's Elnathan or Abner. I get mixed up between the two. But she had a son, and after her brother was killed in the Civil War, there weren't going to be any more male Mitchells in Washington. So she got her son, who was born, was it Elnathan or was it Abner?
I know Abner is the one who lost his life in the Civil War.
I think it was that maybe Elnathan was the son's, was the son's name, Elnathan, because there was a tradition of going back and forth between Abner and Elnathan with the males in that family. So she convinced her son, Elnathan Buckingham, to change his family name to Mitchell so that the Mitchell name would continue in Washington. And my mother knew a woman named Mary Helen Mitchell, who was a friend of hers growing up in Fairfield, who was a direct descendant of Mary Helen Mitchell Buckingham. And to see that photograph, I was, quite impressed because that, takes you back another generation with that family. And I didn't know that photograph existed. And it's a great photograph.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, and I think that probably dates to the it's pretty early. I think those are probably from like the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s or so.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I didn't realize how involved she was in the Judea Female Seminary as a teacher.
So where was the Wesley House? What location is that now, or do you know?
Yeah, so we actually, I don't know if I could go back. We have the map of Washington Green here. Let me see if I could get us back to there. And if you're all familiar where Peter Becker lives on Kirby Road, Peter Becker lives, the headmaster at the gunnery lives in this house, excuse me, right here, this house right here, T.F. Brimsmaid's house. And Alan, I see, who joined us today, his house is not on this map yet. It wasn't moved there and constructed, but what we know is the Abbey would have been right on this lot right here. And so the Judea Female Seminary, which Frederick Gunn later called the Wesley House when he had acquired the property, was located right where this red arrow is pointing on the east side of Kirby Road on Washington Green, just south of what we know as the Abbey property today, named after Abigail Gunn. And I think that's sort of the vicinity of where the gunnery has an entrance, and there's an old gatehouse to the old Bourne estate right there. And I think there's a new gunnery parking lot that was constructed last year. So I think that's right where the seminary building was located. It was at one point, as we learned in our last reading a couple weeks ago, a Methodist church that was located right on Kirby Road. So you could touch the church from the road, and then it was moved back by Henry Woodruff about 40 feet from the road, and some alterations were made to the building, and that's when it started to have its various uses, and the seminary had moved in there. And so it sounds like the Judea Female Seminary started right here, if you see my cursor moving around this map, in the home of General Daniel Bourbon Brimsmaid. And this is where the paper said it was also later the site of the Brownlee Inn. So the Brimsmaid home was torn down. This was located just to the left of the Poe and the cafe on the green on Kirby Road, right next to the sidewalk. So that was torn down. And then Brownlee, we saw that picture of the big Brownlee Inn that was constructed during the Victorian times, the 1880s or so, 1890s, right a little bit further back from the road on the same property. And then Brownlee, the Brownlee Inn was torn down in the 1940s around the World War II era. So the Judea Female Seminary starts in General Brimsmaid's house here. Then it went over to Mr. Hines' house over here where you see the cursor. who was a relative, and we now know of that as the Woodruff House, which is still standing on the west side of Kirby Road near the church. And then I guess it moved down into the former Methodist church. And that's where it ended its existence after about, I guess, a decade or more down there on Kirby Road. So this is a really fascinating story, I think, of yet another educational institution here in Washington's history that I don't think too many people know about.
Well, now, was Brownlee named after the Brown family, I assume?
Yeah, I think, Mary Brimsmaid, the founder of the Judea Female Seminary, she married a Brown. I don't want to get his first name wrong. I think it may have been George.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling that it may have been named for him. But don't quote me.
Yeah.
I see Sally has a question or comment. Let me try to unmute you, or if you could unmute yourself.
Dan can't hear you.
Oh no, Dan, you can't hear me?
I guess, can you unmute yourself on the left, Dan? Left in the bottom. Left bottom, there's a microphone. You can unmute yourself. Should be able to do that.
Okay, Sally, I think you have the floor.
I was going to ask, do we know who designed or built the seminary? It has some Rossiter looks to it, but we don't know who the architect was.
So in the paper a couple weeks ago, which sort of connects to this, it was more of a history of the Wesley House. It sounded like it was constructed by a mill owner who lived down on River Road, and his name was Armand Olmsted. And that paper talked about how he had supplied the lumber for the construction of the building, and it sounded like he was the one who built it. And Armand Olmsted's house still stands on River Road. If you're at the intersection of Moody Bridge Road and River Road, and if you look to the west, it's that Greek Revival house that's still standing on River Road. And this that picture that we let's see, I have that picture here. The picture that we have of the right there of the Wesley House. It's my theory that this photograph was taken after it was moved back 40 feet from the road, because it doesn't look so much like a Methodist church to me. I'm thinking this part was the Methodist church that was right next to the road, that main part there. And then I suspect that some of these other parts were added on when it was later converted into a residence. It didn't talk about it in this paper, but it talked about it in the history of the Wesley House that we heard a couple weeks ago.
So I'm going to leave.
And there were some people who were renting this as a summer place. So this, right, does sort of look like it has some Eric Rossiter influences in this. And I don't have any written documentation that he was involved, but he was clearly here in Washington, and he was designing and building many homes on Washington Green around this time period when this would have been moved back from the road and converted into a private residence. And I think there's a good chance that Eric Rossiter may have been the architect who was involved in the redesign of this, although I've never seen that documented or written anywhere. But a great observation, Sally. It looks like one of his shingle style.
Yeah, particularly on the right-hand side, yes.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, okay.
Yep. Any other questions or comments out there? I see Peter is raising his hand, and Peter, you could unmute yourself, or I could try to unmute you. Hi, I think you're unmuted. How are you doing?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much. 3 little questions.
Sure.
One is, what is the interesting backdrop that you use behind you in presenting this?
Right. So let me see if I could Oh, hold on. Let's see. Can everyone see that? I don't know if I can make that any bigger. Actually, let me get rid of myself and you can see it a little bit better. So this is one of my favorite photographs from the museum's collection. And this is River Road in Washington Depot, now known as Main Street. And if you're familiar with the old Parks Drug Store building, the photographer is standing behind the Parks Drug Store building, looking towards, I would say that's sort of the northwest across Main Street. And what we're looking at is the Washington Market building. This is the present day backside to the Washington Market building. But when this photograph was taken, I believe in the 1940s, this I think is before the flood of 1955, you would enter the market from Main Street, from this side of the building. And to the right of the market building, you could see the brick, a part of the brick building that's still there today. That's the Washington liquor store, but you might be able to see a little bit of the sign there. It was Leone's shoe store. So that was what was in that brick building before that. And it's probably really hard to see, but right in the corner of the market building was the Washington, it was called like the cold storage locker, where you could rent refrigerated space and you could store vegetables, half of a cow or whatever you wanted to there, and you could access the cold storage when you wanted to get some of your frozen foods out of that. And then to the far left of this building, the market building, there were some more storefronts in there, and that's the former Washington Depot Railroad Station for the Chippewa Valley Railroad. That's where it was located. And after the flood of 1955, it was lifted off its foundation, moved a little bit further to the west across Canoe Brook, and it became the VFW Hall, the Gage Zump American Legion, excuse me. And the present day Senior Center is on the top floor of that building. And after it was moved from that site, it became the bank and the post office that you guys are familiar with today. The brick structure was constructed there. Yes.
And the name, Stephen, the name was changed from Main Street to River Road because there was already another Main Street in New Preston. And so they decided to change the name to River Road. And of course, behind those buildings would have been where the railroad tracks were for the Chippewa Railroad. So the other side was a very busy area for the railroad and for unloading things and people getting out and doing all that. And this side, really, the only thing on that side of what is now River Road in terms of a business is the liquor store. And the one side of the Judy Black Park, of course, and on the other side is the building where the pharmacy used to be.
Right. Yes, Peter.
Two other questions about the seminary. From what ages to what ages could the girls attend the seminary? And would that include like kindergarten or first grade? And then how far did it go up? And the second question is, it looks as if it was totally a day school, not a boarding school, so that the students would have to either walk or ride or be driven every day to the school. Those are my two questions.
Sure. And I think I'll take the second one first. Yeah, there, from what I understand, when the, let me get to that map if I could find it again. When the Judea Female Seminary was in Daniel Bourbon Brimsmaid's house, they did have students boarding with them in the house. I believe up to 10 girls could fit into the house with them while the school operated in the Brimsmaid house to the left of the present day Poe, which would be right there, and the cafe. But, it mentioned that there were up to 60 or 70 students, girls who would attend the school. So that's a large number. And so many of the other girls would board, I think up to 10 girls in these other houses around Washington Green. So I've seen some documentation that some of the girls were boarding in this Levitt house on the corner of Parsonage Lane and Green Hill Road that's labeled W. Levitt on the map. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some of these girls from the Judea Female Seminary boarding in your house, Peter, which is right here on the map, M. Levitt's house. And we know that also in the church's house down here on the south part of the green, and probably the Fenn's house and the Smith's house and possibly the Galpin's house, and maybe even the museum building, which we see on the map here, the Gunn Museum, was the residence of S.H. Mitchell right here. I would suspect that there were girls boarding in all these houses around the green and perhaps some further afar. So girls definitely would have had to walk to school in the morning or maybe get a carriage ride over to the Judea Female Seminary. So that's a great question. And I'm not as sure about the age range for the students who would be attending the school. I suspect they may have been a mix of ages, perhaps a little bit younger than what we maybe consider high school age today. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were some girls there in their early teens that we might consider maybe, you know, middle school, 6th, 7th, or 8th grade today through high school age. But I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has more experience about the age of the girls that may have been attending.
I noticed one thing, that one of the students on that long list was Silence Brimsmaid.
Right.
And as you know, I'm interested in that family because of their connection with our house. She's partway down the first column.
Right.
And I think in 1850, she could have only been about 7 years of age.
Okay.
So that made me think that they must have included very like first grade or something also in the school.
Yeah.
Which I think if true, it's great. I love it.
But it could have been another Silence Brimsmaid too, because I think that, you know, certain names would tend to be repeated within.
Well, the mother was called Silence Brimsmaid, and she died when young Silence was 2 weeks old.
Oh.
And so this girl here in 1850 must have been the young Silence.
Yeah, and I see a middle initial here. It looks like possibly Silence L. Brimsmaid.
It could be
Silence Levitt Brimsmaid.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, if it is her, that's a great observation that they may have had very young girls here. And one thing that might suggest that is, I think it had mentioned that some of the girls would be doing handiwork, and I interpreted that into meaning that they may have been, you know, stitching or sewing a sampler. And oftentimes, you know, we have a great collection of samplers here in the Gunn Museum's collection that some of the girls created here in Washington. And, you know, they typically would be young girls, I think, in that age range, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, sewing these samplers. So, you know, we could probably do a closer analysis of these names here through the census. And we know that this was the class list in 1850. And we could probably fairly easily determine what age all these students were when they were attending her school in 1850 by looking at the census for that year. That's a nice little research project that we could.
Stephen,
unfortunately, the date
open now. I hope to bring you the results of my modest researches on the Levitts and Brimsmaid from the standpoint of our house.
Right.
But I think, again, you did a terrific job on this thing today. Absolutely. I mean, for those of us interested in history, this is just riveting. I'm also very proud that Washington, Connecticut had a role in important women's education early. That's a terrific thing.
Yeah, I think that is a real important point to bring up, and that's what really caught my attention. That so many people from Washington, so many women at such an early time in history were well educated and attended Mount Holyoke. And there was this group called the Litchfield County Circle of these girls, these alumni, who had attended Mount Holyoke and came back. There's a little footnote on this paper. I think I'm just going to read it. It's a couple sentences because it talks about this Litchfield County Circle. It says the Litchfield County Circle was originally composed of 7 graduates of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary who went there in 1843. They all roomed on the same corridor and were placed in the same classes. At that time, housework was a part of the daily schedule of Mount Holyoke students, and they were divided into circles for that purpose. As for instance, the dish circle, the potato circle, and the pie circle. Emmeline Steele had pleasing duty of keeping Miss Mary Lyons's room in order, arranging flowers for its decoration, and so on. The 7 girls in the Litchfield County Circle were Mary Brimsmaid Brown, Emmeline Steele Vale, Eleanor Boudinot Church, Harriet Landon Lee, Mary Comstock Dunnock, Ellen Lewis Page, and Charlotte Franklin. And it goes on a little bit more, but it's just amazing that their education at Mount Holyoke inspired, especially Mary Brimsmaid, to create the Judea Female Seminary here in Washington. And then some of her friends who went to school with her at Mount Holyoke became her assistants and teachers here at the Judea Female Seminary. And then there was this generational inspiration. Students of the Judea Female Seminary then went on to establish their own schools. So the Ingleside School in New Milford was founded by a student of the Judea Female Seminary. And then I think most prominently was the Rosemary Hall School for Girls and the Choate School for Boys, which merged, I think, in the 60s or 70s into, a very prominent school we know today as Choate Rosemary Hall down in Wallingford. And, the founder of that school was a student of the Judea Female Seminary here in Washington. So there's this long generational interest in educating women here in Washington, and it continues on in these institutions today. I think it's a really important thing to note and to be proud of here in Washington.
Stephen, unfortunately, the 1850 census is June 1st.
Oh, okay.
So that would be, unless the school was still in session in, June 1st in 1850. I don't know if you would find any of these students, in the census.
Right. So that would be difficult. We could maybe go back or look at 1860 just to sort of get an idea of how old they are, or maybe death records might reveal their age. So I saw both Alan and Sally had their hands up. I'll go to Alan. First. How you doing?
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep, I can.
I have to sign off. I enjoyed this very much. Just wanted to make one minor comment, which
Sure.
is that you mentioned that the founder went to Packer Collegiate in Brooklyn for a couple of years. My son-in-law is the head of the physics department there.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's an amazing mention. Wow.
So.
I haven't reached out to them, but I would love to know what they might have in their archive about Mary Brimsmaid, and maybe he could point me in the right direction.
I'll ask him. Sure.
Yeah, that would be wonderful to see if he has any information on her.
Okay. Well, it was nice hearing this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alan.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Sally, I think, had her hand.
Yep. I was going to respond to Peter. And I don't know this is a fact, but I'm guessing that not all 70 girls were there at the same time. And the only reason I'm saying that is that because I've done some transcribing of gun letters. So I know it when John Gunn Brimsmaid was head of the gunnery, he would say, oh, so-and-so's coming and so-and-so's leaving, and they were there for a couple of months and then they'd go home. And the same thing with the Whittlesey School here in New Preston. Whittlesey had kids staying here, but they weren't always, it wasn't like you went to school in September and left in May. It seemed to be a much more fluid, let's say, situation. So I'd be surprised if they were all there at the same time. But maybe they were, I don't know. But I'm just telling you from my experience, it looked to me like students came in, they went home, they came back. You know.
Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense that there could have been terms, maybe they would come in the springtime or the fall time. And I just counted the names on this circular here, and I think there's 54 students listed here. Bill, I think I saw your hand. How are you doing? I think we just need to unmute you or unmute yourself. Oh, there you go.
I'm back on. Couple comments. One if you stay on this page, was Lydia Beecher one of the Beechers?
Yeah, that's a good point. Lydia D. Beecher.
We talked about Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe sent kids to the gunnery.
Right.
To the gunnery. I wonder whether this is a Beecher daughter. I don't remember at this point what kids he had.
Yeah.
Second comment is for Peter, who I think just got off the call. The Packer archives are now at the Brooklyn Historical Society.
Oh, okay.
And so if anybody would like to look at that, I'm on the board of the Brooklyn Historical Society, and we can get you access to anything there.
Oh, great.
And then the other thing, you could go back to, you have the one slide on Mary at Packer.
Yeah, is this it? Or,
So it was the
listing, right?
The listing, it was the.
There we go. Could everyone see that?
If you look at her name, which is where the arrow is, she is the only woman who is not listed with a miss in front of it. And I always found that very interesting, that she was a feminist or a women's rights advocate very early on. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. And you could see that the other, Miss Jane Hart, Miss Susan, Miss Josephine.
And then if you go down below, the teachers of the different department, they're all listed as Miss.
Miss,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. And so she was not married.
Mary is not.
She must have clearly told them how to list her name.
Yes.
She must have married when she was older then.
She was much older, I think, when she got married. I didn't realize she was married. Because at the time she was in Brooklyn, I don't believe she was married.
Yeah, I think you're
the
right.
other comment I would like to make about the minister of the Congregational Church, whose name I don't remember.
Gordon Hayes.
Yeah, the parallel in Brooklyn at the time was a man named Henry Jackson Van Dyke. Henry Jackson Van Dyke was the first of three Van Dykes who were Presbyterian ministers. He was a Presbyterian minister, old school, for those of you who know that period, which meant that he was pro-Southern and pro-slavery in Brooklyn, and which is not very unusual at the time in Brooklyn. And his grandson whose name I think was Tertius Van Dyke, became the minister of the Congregational Church in the 1930s.
Right.
So there was one of these other connections between Brooklyn and Washington.
Yeah, there are a lot of connections between Brooklyn and Washington.
Yeah, and one of our museum volunteers, Paula Krimsky, is related to the Van Dykes. So there are a lot of connections there, and this Reverend Gordon Hayes, he was a character. You guys are probably all aware that he was also responsible for driving Frederick Gunn out of Washington. So Frederick Gunn was an abolitionist, and he believed strongly in that cause. And the story goes, Reverend Hayes told his parishioners that they should not allow their children to attend Frederick Gunn's school. And so the numbers quickly dwindled in, I guess that's the 1840s. And so Frederick Gunn decided to leave Washington with his wife, Abigail, and they went to Towanda, Pennsylvania, and they established a school down there for a few years. And Frederick Gunn really didn't come back to Washington, I think, until right around 1850 when he reestablished the gunnery, and things had sort of calmed down, and Reverend Hayes sort of left town or was driven out of town by that point. So he was
Wasn't the
critical of Frederick Gunn and Mary Brimsmaid because of the calisthenics, which I think are sort of like gymnastics, right, that she was doing on Washington Green and at her school. It would have been highly inappropriate during that time period, according to this minister.
But accordingly, he was messing with a family that had big influence in Washington, the Brimsmaids, and I think that was sort of his downfall, I think.
Right. You don't want to mess with the Brimsmaids. They were one of the early and very prominent families here in town. So yeah, we could probably do some more research into Gordon Hayes, but I think he was probably encouraged to leave at that point. Any other questions or comments out there? I wanted to mention something of interest. So the paper was written by Amy Kenyon, and you know, I've mentioned her a little bit before. We see a photograph of her here. She, I believe, was a faculty member over at the gunnery, and also probably, I think, from Brooklyn. You'll see this photograph was taken down in Brooklyn, and she was quite interested in Washington's history and was a very important historian here in town, and she saved a lot of the things that we have in the Gunn Museum's collection, and we give her great thanks for doing that, for preserving that for us and for future generations. So the name Amy Kenyon, you folks may be familiar with Kenyon Clark. He's a museum volunteer, a great tennis player, lives in the Logan Tavern over on Romford Road. So he is named for the Kenyon family, which is connected to his family here. So Kenyon Clark sent me this little note. He said, "My great-grandfather married Eliza Preston Kenyon in 1875. Amy Kenyon would have been Walter Seth Logan Jr., my grandfather's aunt." And he said that he had asked his mother, Hollis Logan Clark, what Amy taught at the gunnery, and she thought she was involved in teaching sports at the gunnery, which is interesting. So we'll have to do a little bit more research into Amy Kenyon too, but she's always been someone who has been of great interest to me. Did
she do the World War I scrapbook?
Yes. Amy Kenyon also saved all the Washington newspaper articles and glued them into 2 amazing scrapbooks related to Washington in World War I, which we used as a basis for our national award-winning World War I exhibit a few years back in 2014. So yeah, we thank her for creating those great scrapbooks about what was happening in Washington during World War I. Any other questions or comments out there? I think Sally has one, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. It's terrific. Very, very interesting. Look forward to the next one.
Great. Yep. Thank you, Peter. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing the next and final one for this series. Sally, oops, I think you're unmuted, right?
I am now. I just wanted to say about Amy Kenyon. She also wrote a book called The Master of the Gunnery about Frederick Gunn. Okay. And she continued corresponding with Abby Brimsmaid Gunn for years and years. So those are some of the letters that I've been transcribing for Paula for the archives at the gunnery. And they're wonderful because she talks about some of the students, but she also talks about what's going on in the world, and how are you, Abby, and how are things in Florida, and they did a lot of writing letters back then, so it was really fun to read those.
Oh, that's great that you're able to see that personal insight into who she was and what her life was like. Those letters and diaries, the primary source documents, are the best.
And we're not going to have them anymore because everybody's doing everything on the internet, and it's really sad.
It's true. It's our emails are not going to be preserved in coming generations. We'll be the lost generation, unfortunately. Any other questions or comments out there from the audience? David, I see your hand up.
Now, was Kenyon her family name, or was that her married name? Or
Yeah,
did she marry?
I don't think she married. Do you know?
Okay.
Sally?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So that's her family name. So she,
Okay.
it sounds like maybe a sister of this Eliza Kenyon who married into the Logan family.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And and Kenyon Clark is named after that family name.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions or comments out there?
Stephen, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. So I want to remind you here, please join us in 2 weeks on Monday, June 29th at 10 o'clock at the same
Sounds good.
link for Old Time Industries in Washington by Edith Heath Rossiter. That was written in 1915. And this will be our final reading in this series. Going into July and August, we're going to maybe try some different kind of programming, and then we'll see where the pandemic is in the fall, and maybe we could have in-person programs by then, hopefully. And please, we all welcome you back into the museum starting on the 20th of this month. We're going to post some rules on our website, you know, face masks and things like that. And it's going to be by appointment only. So take a look at that once we get it up on our website this week, and make an appointment to come and visit us and see our great award-winning exhibit about the history of Washington that's on display here. And we look forward to seeing you in person, and everyone stay safe and stay well. We'll see you back here on Zoom in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Okay, bye.
It was terrific, absolutely terrific.